All right. It's 11 o'clock on the nose. Lisa, we good to go?
We are good to go. Thanks, Heather.
Okay. All right. So welcome back and welcome to our policy session for today. So this one is always, really and highly anticipated, and we always have lots of great discussion around, what are some of these best ways to pull the lever of policy so that we can get at this, like real and lasting change that we're looking for. So the format for this 2-hour session is that we're going to have 3 presentations. And then we have about 45 minutes of a panel discussion and then 15 minutes of Q&A that Lisa and I kind of talked about, just squishing into a 1-hour block that we really want to be interactive and discussion based. We missed that element of the in-person marine debris. So we wanted to give everybody a heads up at the beginning to get ready to unmute, and we invite you to share your perspectives, ask questions that you have. If you want to make a counterpoint, go at it. You want to raise new policy topics we haven't talked about. So we just want to put that in your heads that after the presentation section, we're gonna really want to try to have an interactive discussion. So feel free to just unmute. If there is somebody else talking, you can also raise your hand and we can get to you that way. So get ready for that part. That's always the funnest. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Nina Butler, you will remember from yesterday if you joined the Marine Debris Symposium. She is the CEO of More Recycling, which is a mission-based research and information technology firm striving to harmonize human behavior with the natural world. And Nina, after you had to jump off yesterday, several folks just said how much they loved that definition, and maybe we could just adopt that as the new definition of ecology. Nina believes in delivering unbiased guidance and navigating the role that plastics play in the movement towards circular supply chains, valuing carbon and reducing greenhouse emissions. And then we have Dr. Nancy Lauer, who received her PhD from Duke Nicholas School of the Environment in 2018, where her dissertation research focused on water quality and environmental contamination. And after graduating, Nancy joined the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic as the Science and Policy Fellow, where she worked on a number of environmental policy matters at the state and local level, including children's exposure to toxic chemicals, drinking water quality, remediation of hazardous waste sites, and single-use plastics. In January 2019, the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic began representing the local nonprofit Don't Waste Durham, and have been working to understand the environmental and economic implications of single-use items and to develop policy strategies that encourage our community to reduce its single-use footprint. And then finally, we're going to have Stuart Harris, who is the Senior Director of Marine and Environmental Stewardship at the American Chemistry Council's, or ACC's, Plastic Division. Stuart is responsible for developing and implementing ACC's global and domestic marine debris policy, and he is the chair of the Plastic Industries Global Action Team, which implements the declaration of the Global Plastics Associations for Solutions on Marine Litter. Can't say that one. As part of the global declaration, 80 signatories from 43 countries have implemented over 395 projects addressing marine litter since 2011. Stuart engages on the international advocacy, he engages in international advocacy and global diplomacy on behalf of the World's Plastics Council and the International Council of Chemical Associations. He has a Master's of Science degree in Marine Estuary and Environmental Science from the University of Maryland and a Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Bucknell University. So I am going to turn it over to the speakers. Nina, I think that we have you up first.
Thank you, Heather. Put my slide. Here we go. So I should show my, over here is my long time ago, also got to go to Duke. So great to have you on the panel. So I want to apologize for those who were on yesterday. I was torn between including some of the foundational slides that kind of set the stage for how we navigate some of these complex topics. I was just thinking last night after the call, Scott and Bonnie and I joined a team of folks that are working on some global initiatives. And it was, as we peel back this onion, with nature, there's always this interconnected. It's how do we put value on the services that nature provides? How do we put value on carbon? And then from that, and this is what I learned at Duke, how do we navigate those trade-offs? So for those who have, I've already done this introduction, but for those who weren't on, that we are a mission-based company, and our core focus areas are doing research, collaborating, and raising awareness. And we do that through the technology that we've developed, different tools to make information publicly available. And then from a policy perspective, I testified in June, and out of that, there were about 22 questions that senators asked that forced me to write like a diatribe of all of my thoughts around policy. But it's the perspective of looking back over 20 years of tracking and really trying to optimize the system that I can see a lot of these challenges. So our company has been tracking as much as we can the plastic recycling landscape. Here's kind of an overview of where the trends are. And to always put it in the backdrop that you can't look at plastic in a vacuum, because we are dealing with many other materials, and how we manage plastics affects how we are able to manage other materials and vice versa. So I wanted to look at, here's just a chart looking at where the flow for PET bottles. This is the most mature of the recycling commodities. My former boss, Patty Moore, really got into this business by focusing to develop when there wasn't really a PET recycling industry. And what is disheartening is that to look at where the material flow is, if this is the most mature, this is as good as we're doing, basically. And I think there's some obvious responses. Like, we know from data that bottle bills work, but we're not deploying that type of tool the way that we could. In Europe, there's an embrace around bottle bills. And I think Lithuania was the last one, I could be wrong on this, that added a bottle bill. And it took only 3 years to triple from 30% to 90% recycling rate. The data is pretty compelling. So to kind of get this a little more grounding, when we're looking at what the MRFs, the material recovery facilities, or the recyclers that have to deal with what we put out at the curb, they're really dealing with a lion's share of paper and cardboard. So we always have to keep that in the backdrop. Plastics only represent 5% to them. And then to put that in the context of how much plastic we produce, it's roughly 43% goes into packaging and containers. And what we have to really put our focus on is, as we move to lightweight things and use the most fuel efficient material, there's a movement to use more film. That's now 28% of packaging, and our system's not designed to handle that. So it's, thinking about, particularly in the time of COVID, it's difficult to look at a material that would be better than plastic to package toilet paper or air filters or bread. I mean, ideally we can bake all of our own bread. My daughter's been doing it, but I haven't. And it's also one of the areas, as we look at a lot of this, we've been teetering around the 30% mark for bottles. Film has been one of the areas that had been growing overall, but it's been dropping the last couple of years, except this one category, which is where the consumer takes material back to the retail. It's also an interesting kind of case study on, we've had this general trend to commingle everything together because it's easier. But when we keep it separate, we have more options for the most efficient and lowest environmental impact way to recover it. This picture, it's kind of a picture is worth 1,000 words. So in the back it's the packaging, it's paperboard to package diapers. In the front is a pallet that packages diapers, the equivalent number of diapers. One is film, one is cardboard. One pallet compared to 14 pallets. That's just massive energy savings all across the entire life cycle. And if you keep kind of peeling back this onion, I had the privilege to be able to use cloth diapers because I worked from home and I could wash diapers in the very humid South. Trying to dry organic diapers was on the clothesline was kind of gross, but I tried, and I did surrender back then to polyester reusable diapers. Therein lies kind of this paradox that we struggle with. What is the most efficient overall? and this is before I was more aware, my kids are now 13 and 11, of the microplastic issue. But here's an example of where we really got to be clear of what we're choosing. Also looking at it from a system perspective, when we look at the total volume of material, commercial material really dwarfs the residential material, post-consumer material. So it's looking at it from where are the opportunities for efficiency and how we recover material. If the retailer's already dealing with a large volume of commercial film when they're unpacking and moving product, then are we piggybacking on it and then taking some of the pressure off of the recycler that the system's not designed to really separate film? So just, I want to keep this in how material flows and where the logistics are and where the potential for very large scale reverse logistics. This is a bit dated, this data. This is all the locations of drop-off locations for film across the United States. So the pattern here is where there's population. And I would say now there's more retailers in the Carolinas taking back film and bags from the public than California. So from a policy perspective, it's been pretty damning for this infrastructure to have bans, even with requirement for recycled content and encouraging retailers to offer bins. It's had sort of a lot of unintended consequences. But this number has been dwindling, but in general, retailers across the country are taking this material because they're already generating a lot of the other material. So here's kind of an example of California counties that had bag bans, and then there was the entire statewide bag ban, and it went from a few years ago when we did our spot check of a drop of 30%, it's down to, it's really, I think, struggling on the brink right now. So going back to what's the mix of material? How do we handle this material? What's the future mix of material? Bottles make up the lion's share of what goes in the bin. So that's at 75%. But as we move to lighter materials, we're also moving to smaller format materials. And that represents 15%. So when you break that out even further, we have a highly fragmented stream, and it is going to require a more systems-based regional approach to develop the infrastructure to really get after these quality materials. It also is going to require looking upstream in terms of how we design for the system based on the materials that we really need. And then the bigger question to me, there's a study out of University of Michigan. This does not include PET, so it'd actually be over 100 billion pounds for virgin material. And this is from ACC PIPS group. What about all the material beyond packaging? That's really the piece that has to stay on our radar as we look at what do we need, what can we use in terms of best material, and what do we do with everything that still remains? So, and then we have to look at it also in a global perspective. So I shared this yesterday, but we have projected the forecasts of growth and demand. The green line is represents petrochemical products. 50% of base chemicals go into making plastics. That's growing as a percentage. And then we see a tapering off of demand overall for oil and gas. That's the refined products, partly because we're lightweighting things and moving towards more electric vehicles and alternative energy. So this is kind of how do we navigate this kind of growth projection? And as we talked about yesterday, the break free from plastic, I think, is the nudging that we need to really get into how we look at the core challenges that are facing our ability to manage this material. So for those who weren't on yesterday, I encourage you to think about what you would be willing to give up to break free from plastic. And I don't know how much overlap, Heather and Lisa, but I think it's important to keep this in mind. Like, from every bit of infrastructure that's in our house that give us the creature comforts to our ability to be online right now, and all the medical equipment being used, particularly during a pandemic. And as I said yesterday, I think at the very core, the reason we're living so far out of balance is because we have an equity issue. And I think for me, it's number 4 within these 8 priority lists of actions that the president can take that's really important. Number two gives me a little pause because we have to leave room for what kind of technology will solve the problem for all those other materials that aren't even on our radar in terms of breaking free from plastic or what gets handled in the recycling stream. And also to think about it, that we are in the age of technology, and that all is on the foundation of plastics. So better science for better decisions. I want to also keep driving this point home that in the backdrop of what are we trading off if we go to heavier materials, and that how much of our focus really needs to be on policy that's going to stimulate conservation of water, regenerative agriculture, reducing food waste, addressing food waste deserts. That all is very important, and it becomes very complicated when we look at what role plastics play. So since I kind of skipped through some of this, the break free from plastic does address the subsidies. This is the most conservative estimate at 20 billion dollars. If you include externalized costs, it gets into the trillions globally, and we're not the only country that does it. It's part of our security. So this is a newer slide. Here's the breakout, and this is a few months old, of the cost to process. With virgin, if the price is around 50 cents, to get to a near virgin quality post-consumer resin that can go into food contact products, it costs almost twice as much. So on the far left is if you do the minimal processing for colored HDP bottles, and that's not the mixed bales that you have to further segregate, but this is just if you're buying HDP bottles or if you're buying colored HDP bottles. So the price right now, because there's less and less supply of this, we're actually making fewer milk jugs, which is where we depend on getting our feedstock. So if it's supply and demand, if there's less supply and there's a lot more demand, prices are really quite through the roof right now. So we need to have these solutions that scale the problem. If the value proposition is not there to invest in the recycling infrastructure because it's less expensive to dispose and it's more expensive to use the material, even though it has much lower carbon footprint. Here's the difference between using PCR for PET versus virgin. So if our goal is to have a drawdown in demand, why are we not prioritizing from a policy perspective use of recycled content? So I just want to kind of run through these. The cost to collect and process recycled plastic can't compete on a global scale. Virgin production simply outpaces reclamation capacity. And that's not just in the US, that's in other places as well. Even plastics with highly developed markets like PET struggle with recycling. The design for incompatibility of some existing and newly emerging packaging within existing infrastructure. So we have to have better design up front. But you have to design because you know what your North Pole, like your North Star is. Where are you trying to design towards? It's a highly fragmented system that lacks the feedback. And in a good economic efficient system, you have to have the feedback loops. So here's kind of just drilling in a little bit more into the projection. This comes from a company called IHS Markit that does looks at tracking petrochemical upstream. And we did a study with them recently looking at basically where does the price of carbon need to be to shift petrochemical companies from being in rivalry, competing with PCR and substitution to other materials, versus where does it make sense for petrochemical companies to essentially vertically integrate and move into it. Both scenarios are troubling to me in terms of looking at the total growth and how much more plastic waste we're going to see. So I think this drives home the point for just much more aggressive action. And just for me, from a policy perspective, bottom line, we need to manage carbon. We want to keep it, save the molecule, basically, not move to something that's going to burn even more fuel as we're moving product around. So local, less is better. And the call that I was on last night with Ralph Shammy from the IMF, as we look at the context of addressing climate change, the plastic waste problem, what we've fundamentally failed to do, I think, from a policy perspective, is look at instead of the problem, what are the ecosystems that are intact and can be strengthened? How do we put value on the service that these particular species, salt marshes provide in terms of carbon sequestration, and all of our quality of life that sustains life. So I think this at the very, very core of policy needs to exist. So I wanted to kind of go big picture and then back into detail. I was also kind of thinking about what are some of the initiatives, tools, resources that kind of give me hope or that I think can be catalyst for this paradigm shift and to focus on natural capitalism. There is a push to look at a global a plastic agreement for plastic. And I think that just has a dotted line to a carbon policy. And if we want to address the plastic problem, we have to look at it in terms of trying to keep as much plastic contained. Organizations like WWF that have the resource tool that's really providing that transparency, accountability and transparency are essential in a capitalistic system. You've got to have those feedback loops, know where the cost is and where the reward is. So the US Plastic Pact is looking at that roadmap of how do we navigate this, this progress towards more responsible use of this material. Upstream has information about reuse, and then really continuing to track the data that gives us the information that we need to make better decisions. So just a few more things to go through that I think we need to pay attention to. Basel, SEPA, how we're managing the chemicals in plastics. The plastics directive is really driving a lot of thinking on policy and how do we track use of recycled content. So just wanted to end with the tools that we have that we're hoping to support better decisions for circularity. The info exchange is where we try to have a clearinghouse of information, past and present, of where has market development activity happened across the country? What are those tools? How do you learn from other peers, basically, on programs that are working or not working? And you can see different patterns as you get into this directory, but we hope to continue to expand this and share information so we're not reinventing the wheel. Before we were able to send material to for export at the larger rate that we were starting, around in 2000, there was a ton of work on market development through EPA, jobs through recycling. And we've that kind of went off of our radar. And that is something to really get back into focus. Market development and policy to support an optimized recovery system that reduces impact has to be steeped in basic manufacturing. You have to have supply and demand. And we swing the pendulum often pretty hard without looking at the whole system. So this is why we're sharing this platform, making it publicly available and looking for partners to continue to expand circularityinaction.com, helping each of the different stakeholders around the value chain drive circularity. I shared this yesterday as well, but it's the first movement towards getting a roadmap to really what are the key elements of recyclability, and ideally moving towards policy that drives circularity, recycled content, lowest environmental impact, and recyclability. So I wanted to end with this: better policy, greater innovation, more action. There's the short term. We do need more minimum content, bottle bills, and we also need an EPR in particular that's steeped in with eco-modulation, but we also need to be looking at it from a global perspective. We need to open up the opportunities for innovation and leverage the incredible power of the tech world to have the transparency so that we can build reverse logistics and have the science to help redirect. Does the material go to chemical recycling? Does it go to mechanical recycling? Where's the highest and best use? And helping make this information more publicly available. So we're looking at it through all the various trade-offs. So I don't think I got to share this as much yesterday, but just right now, immediately, we can all be pushing more buying recycled. So did I go too far over?
Nope, absolutely not. That was perfect. All right, Nancy, I think you are up next.
Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep, we gotcha.
And you can see your view, not the presenter view?
Yep.
Great. I always
Always
feel
good
like
to check.
it's random which way it goes on me. Okay, thank you so much for having me. So my name is Nancy Lauer. I am the Science and Policy Fellow at the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. And I wanted to start by just giving a quick overview of our clinic. We are essentially a joint enterprise between the Duke Law School and the Duke Nicholas School of the Environment. And we work with student attorneys and student consultants to provide pro bono legal and consulting services to nonprofit clients at the local, state, and national level. And so one of our clients in particular is Don't Waste Durham, and they are, as their name suggests, a nonprofit based in Durham with the goal of reducing the waste that Durham generates at the source. And so we have been working with them for the last couple of years, particularly on trying to get the city of Durham and potentially the county of Durham to pass an ordinance that would require a 10-cent fee on bags at the point of sale. So this would include plastic bags, this would include paper bags. And as we've done this work with Don't Waste Durham, we have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what other communities were doing. And in figuring out what other communities were doing, it became more and more clear that it's really been the local level where we see this big push for plastic reduction policies, and that these local governments, these local municipalities are really emerging as the leaders in plastic reduction policies, at least in the United States. And so what I want to focus on today is really just what we've learned through this process of reviewing pretty much every municipality across the United States that has some kind of bag law on its books. And we started this learning process by asking kind of some of these questions that I have up here on this slide, which are, what were the policy tools that local municipalities have to reduce single-use bags? Which policy tools are going to be effective? What are policies looking like across the United States to reduce single-use bags? And where do those policies fall short? Where are those gaps and those loopholes that makes those policies not quite as effective as they could potentially be? And so I'll get more to actually answering some of these questions today, given the time restraints. Can't answer them as thoroughly as I would love to, but that, I suppose, is what the discussion is for. But I'll start first with just honing in a little bit on why the focus on plastic bags. Why are we choosing that single-use product over other single-use products at this moment? And as all single-use plastics have their own kind of individual issues, we found that single-use plastic bags have pretty striking issues, pretty problematic issues, and that those issues touch a whole bunch of different sectors. And so this first figure that I'm showing here is taken from this paper in Science Advances, and it's showing essentially all of the plastic that's ever been produced and where it's ended up. And so this paper estimated that you have 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic have been produced between 1950 and 2015. And essentially, over half of that plastic has been discarded either into a landfill or in the environment. And so one of the issues that was striking with us with plastic bags being a single-use plastic was that these were pretty much destined either to end up as litter or to end up in a landfill where they'd be incredibly slow to degrade. And we know in North Carolina that landfills tend to be located in low wealth communities and communities of color. This is a really striking paper that kind of outlines how the landfills that have been placed in communities in North Carolina are much more likely to be placed in block groups that have high concentrations of people of color and high concentrations of low wealth people. Now, again, I said, these were issues specific to plastic bags and why we were honing in on them and not just, other single-use plastics. And so to kind of answer that question, we looked into, well, what percentage of municipal solid waste is actually plastic bags. And so we combed through these different waste characterization reports that have been done in different states and then also in this one city, Chicago. And we found that these reports were indicating that plastic bags made up anywhere from 0.3 to about 0.9% of municipal solid waste by weight. And while those percentages, taken out of context, might seem small, to us that's pretty alarming that one very low density item, is making up to 1% of our weight of municipal solid waste going to these landfills. And that's a pretty easy place to gain more landfill space, to divert one of these waste streams away from the landfill that tend to be located in these low wealth and people of color communities. And so, that was, I think, one of the first things we really honed in on. The next big issue with plastic bags is that we tend to see they also are a large component of litter. And they are a very visible component. They're a very transportable component of litter because of how light and they are, and easy to be transported in water, easily transported by wind. And the clinic had been doing these surveys over a number of years in the local streams in Durham. And anecdotally, it was seeming like plastic bags were just a constant component of litter. They would get shredded up into these little pieces. They would also get snagged on these booms that were in streams, and we would pretty much find them anytime that we went out. And so again, it felt like anecdotally we knew that plastic bags were a large component of litter, but we wanted to figure out, okay, statistically, are we looking at plastic bags being a large component of litter? And so we looked at kind of some of the major reports. We characterized what we were finding here in Durham, and we were finding that a lot of these reports that aggregated large data sets of litter were finding that plastic bags specifically were making up about 8% of litter pretty consistently. The numbers from Surfrider are lower at 1.5%, but some of these other reports are showing more like 8%. And again, that just seemed like here's one single-use item is making up 8% of litter. We know litter is incredibly costly to clean up, especially at the local level. And so if you just eliminate this one item, you're making a pretty big dent in cleaning up our litter problem. And then the last problem that I'll talk about today that's pretty unique to plastic bags is the fact that we tend to think that they can be recycled through our materials recovery facilities. And so we tend to place them in our curbside bins where they get taken to our MRFs. And when they are carried along the machines, they end up getting tangled in those machines. They tend to basically wreak havoc on those machines. So this is the materials recovery facility, the Sunoco facility in Raleigh. And you'll see kind of workers alongside these conveyor belts who are just working 12-hour shifts, pulling plastic bags and other non-recyclable items and disposing of them kind of in these bins to ultimately be taken to a landfill. And this is incredibly costly because not only is it costing employee time to remove the bags, it costs employee time to untangle the bags that they're not able to remove and jam the equipment. And then it costs money to replace the wear on these parts over time. And so what we found is that materials recovery facilities in Chicago, San Jose, and New York have reported that these plastic bags can cost them anywhere from $100,000 to $1 million annually. And that's based on employee time, that's based on the wear on parts, parts breaking. And so this is not a cheap problem that we have. Now, I was added to this panel last minute. Initially, you were going to hear from Zoe Diana, who I believe is going to be talking about the work that she's done with the Nicholas Institute on national and global policies to address things like plastic bags and other single-use plastics. And I wanted to highlight that work because it is so incredible, and I think it'll be a really great resource to anybody that's interested. And so what the Nicholas Institute did and what Zoe Diana did was look at plastic policies that have been passed, mostly at the global level, also at the national scale, and some at the local level. And they have created this database that you can find here on the Nicholas Institute website. What we did in the clinic was we really wanted to kind of complement this work. The Nicholas Institute did a great job of compiling those national and global policies. This inventory lacks many of the local policies. And a big reason for that is that there's so many local policies, and it's very tedious to go through them all and to compile them all, and they're ever changing. And so this is really a great hub for those national and global policies. What we've done at the clinic is looked much more at the local level. And when we started looking at the local level, we kind of asked this big picture question of kind of where can local governments intervene in this plastics problem? Where can a local government pass a policy that's going to be effective at reducing the problems with plastic bags, but is going to be something that the city can actually do? And so when we look at this chain of kind of plastics production all the way down to plastics generation and then plastics disposal, kind of the highest place in the chain to intervene is actually reducing plastic production. And then one of the lowest places to intervene is dealing with the capturing of litter and things like litter fines and litter cleanups to get more of that litter that plastic that's already gone into the environment back out of the environment. And so the clinic spent a lot of time down here with litter capture. We spent a lot of time looking at stormwater controls to intercept and remove litter from the stormwater system. And this is an issue that's always going to be there. There's always going to be litter. There's always going to be a need to remove that litter. But as we were doing that work, we felt like we couldn't do this work without also thinking about how can a city act more upstream than this litter capture. And so we started thinking about the more optimal place for a city to intervene with plastics, the problems with plastics, is right here with the waste generation. And how can a city reduce waste at its source? And so that was really where we wanted to fall when we thought about these strategies that a municipality could move forward with. And then again, we stayed zoomed out and we thought about, okay, what are all the things again that a city could pass or could work with to deal with the problem of plastics? And we kind of thought about this as this toolkit of things that a city could do. And so these fall under the categories of plans or commitments. The city could basically in its strategic plan say that by a certain date, they would like to reduce their plastic footprint by this %. This falls under things like we talked about dealing with litter through either fines or stormwater controls, and then bans, fees or taxes, retailer take back programs. So those recycling bins at the storefronts where you can take back your plastic film, or bottle returns, as we've talked about today. And then the last one being consumer education. And knowing that we wanted to intervene again at this level kind of reducing waste generation, that kind of took out plans and commitments and consumer education, litter fines and stormwater controls, and retailer take back programs. We really wanted to get at how do we reduce plastic bags at the source. And from there, we started basically scouring all of the municipalities across the United States that have enacted some kind of ban or some kind of fee or tax on bags. And so before I get into that work, I just want to highlight that, one of the best things you can do would be a combination of all of these policy tools. That we're going to be focusing on these bans and fees and taxes, but really it's, all of these combined would be your strongest policy to put forward in order for a municipality to deal with plastic. We're going to look a little bit in a vacuum and look at kind of bans, fees, and taxes without some of these other policy tools to combine with them. And so what we did in the clinic was we could basically look through all of the ordinances that have been passed in the United States, and we put them into this interactive map. This is done through ArcGIS Online. I would love to actually play with it and show it to you, but I'm way too afraid to do that with Zoom and technology. And so I just have these screenshots here. But if you want to do that yourself, you can go to this link here, and you should be able to access the map and click through it to see the bag ban, the bag fee policies throughout the United States. And so what we're looking at here are kind of the local municipalities are shown as these dots, and then the states are colored whether they have a bag ban, a bag fee, or a ban coupled with a fee. And then if they're not filled in, there's just no state policy there. I will preface this, or I'll give you the caveat in saying that this map is already wrong. That's the issue that you have with compiling these policies, is that as soon as you do it, your map is outdated. And so the last time this was updated was August 2020. It's due for an update very soon. And so you can look at this, and there's certainly things missing. There's certainly things that have changed. That's just the nature of trying to do this work, unfortunately. And if you were to navigate to this map and click on one of these cities, what you'd find is that it'll show up with a pop-up box giving you information on the policy that city has, telling you what is banned or what has a fee placed on it, when that became effective. And then it'll take you, if you click this link to ordinance, it'll take you to the ordinance itself. And that looks like this will pop up. So here's the ordinance for Jackson, Wyoming. So ultimately, in doing this work, we compiled 256 bag ordinances across the United States. And we found that the vast majority of them were bag bans on plastic bags. 204 of them were bag bans. Only 13 of them were bag fees alone, and then 39 cities or towns or counties placed a ban and a fee on different products. So typically that would be a ban on plastic bags and then a fee on paper bags or a reusable bag or any other type of bag. At the time we did this, there were 7 states that had a statewide policy, so either a statewide ban or a statewide fee. 16 states at the time we did this, again, I'm pretty sure that number has gone up, preempt plastic bag policies. So that's 16 states that have when you hear of a ban on bans, those states do not let their local municipalities pass any ordinances that would place restrictions on plastic bags. We found that fees range from about 5 cents to 50 cents, and it varied whether those fees were retained entirely by the city, entirely by the business, or if there was a split where the city would retain some and the business would keep some. And then other things that we were finding in these ordinances was that there would be different nuances, such as some would restrict the policy only to stores of a certain size, either very large stores or very small stores, based on its square footage. And then some ordinances only applied to certain businesses, such as they excluded restaurants. And then some ordinances only applied to certain customers. So typically, if a customer was applied for a supplemental nutritional program, that they would be exempt from the fee. And so I'm running out of time here, but real quick, I'll just talk about where some of these policies we found fell short. And the first was that we see a number of policies that only will restrict bags of a certain thickness. So here's an example from Moab, Utah, where only disposable plastic bags that are less than 2.25 mils in thickness are banned. And what that means is that stores can't offer these thin grocery bags that we typically see, but for free, they can give away these or with no restriction, they can give away these thicker plastic bags. And so that has an even larger environmental footprint than we would, expect to see from these thin plastic bags, and kind of has the opposite effect, unfortunately. We also see a number of policies that will restrict these thin filmed plastic bags, but they'll allow compostable bags. And the issue with that is that many of these stores, or when people bring these bags back to their home, they're not actually being composted. They're being placed in the curbside bin and taken to a landfill, where it's likely that they'll produce even more methane and will not even break down. And so here's a study that's showing that compostable bags basically don't break down when they're placed just in soil. They need to be taken to an actual composting facility that has certain requirements for heat and aeration in order for them to be composted. And so it's very unlikely that these compostable bags that some of these policies are allowing would actually get composted. And then similarly, restricting plastic bags without placing any restrictions on paper bags only allows for paper bags to be an easy replacement. And we know that paper bags also have quite a large carbon and water footprint. And so just making that swap does not necessarily reduce the environmental impact in the way that we would hope. And so I am over time, and we'll end there, but I'd love to talk more about this during the discussion time, and my contact info is below in the bottom right corner, so feel free to directly contact me by email with any more discussion on this. Thank you.
That's perfect, Nancy. Thank you. And you're not over, don't worry. Plenty of time, so. But we can certainly come back to any of those slides or any of the topics that you might have had to skip over at the end.
Great.
All right, Stu.
All right. Are we, oops, did I get rid of, there we go. Well, thank you very much, Heather. Appreciate the opportunity to present again at the North Carolina Marine Debris Symposium. This is one of my favorite events. Sorry that we can't be there in person. But what I thought I'd do, and Nina actually covered a number of my first slides, so I'm going to try to go through them pretty quickly and get to the policy piece of it first. But just as a reminder, I represent American Chemistry Council's Plastics Division. Our members are plastic resin producers with operations in the US. And our view in terms of plastics and other litter in the environment is unacceptable, but that plastics deliver significant benefits to society. And a lot of times we focus on the non-durables, the packaging and other things, but also it's important to remember the advantages that plastics provide in terms of automotive, building and construction, some of the other aspects in our economy. We do feel that we as an industry have a role to play in providing solutions to address plastic waste. Oops. Sorry about that. As a reminder, and I think Nina touched on this, but the environmental footprint of plastics typically is lower than other alternatives. A true cost study in 2016 looked at plastic packaging and consumer goods and found that alternatives had almost 4 times the environmental impact of plastics. We've seen this report before by Dr. Jambeck from 2015, looking at sources of marine litter leaking into the environment. This was updated recently to look at US and other developed countries' contributions through exports. But the general theme remains the same, that mismanagement of plastic waste, whether it's from litter or whether it's from mismanagement of residuals from recycling, contributes significantly to plastic ending up into the environment. The Global Plastics Alliance was announced in 2011 at the 5th International Marine Debris Conference. And it's a group of 80 plastics associations, actually 84 associations from around the world that over the last few years has developed, planned, and implemented nearly 400 projects to address marine debris. We're focused around a declaration that highlights 6 areas: promoting partnerships, supporting research, promoting enforcement, spreading knowledge, enhancing recycling and recovery, and stewarding plastic pellets, the resin material that our members make. Again, continuing to make progress moving forward. Another group that ACC is a part of is the Trash Free Seas Alliance, which again works across the different sectors with the education, with institutions, environmental groups, and the business community coming together with a common goal to address plastic waste in the environment. The TFSA really focuses on research to understand sources. After the Jambeck paper came out, they developed the Stemming the Tide report, which looked at how can we address leakage of plastic in the environment and address the infrastructure gap that we see. That was followed by the Next Wave report, which really focused on how to finance those investments that are needed, which then gave rise to Circulate Capital, which focuses on providing no-cost loans to companies in South and Southeast Asia, which are looking to close that infrastructure gap. There's another project underway that's focused on working with the informal sector, and more information will come out about that in the coming months. Another aspect of our work is really containing and managing those plastic resin pellets. OCS, Operation Clean Sweep, has been around for a number of years. It's a voluntary industry program. And a few years ago, we developed OCS Blue, which was a higher level of that program, which requires companies that subscribe to the OCS Blue level to report on any unrecovered release of resin greater than half a liter, half a kilogram per incident. We're actually collecting data right now that companies collected in 2020 for that, and then we'll move through with a process to report that data over time. And so the main focus of today is talking about policy. ACC has promoted policies to address leakage of plastic into the environment for a number of years: the Microbreed Free Waters Act, the Save Our Seas Act, the 1.0 and 2.0, and policies, local policies supporting straws and utensils on request at different states. Around our policy objectives, in 2018, ACC member companies agreed to 3 goals focused on plastic in the marine environment. The last goal is focused on Operation Clean Sweep Blue, which I just mentioned, that all ACC member companies would join OCS Blue by 2020 and by 2022 for their sites in Canada as well. But the goals that I want to talk about more today are the 2040 goal that 100% of plastic packaging will be reused, recycled, or recovered by 2040, with an interim milestone that 100% of packaging would be recyclable or recoverable by 2030. So to achieve those goals, ACC set up a process to develop a roadmap. How do we get from where we are today to that 2040 goal where we can recycle or recover or reuse 100% of the plastic packaging that's put on the market in the United States? And so with that process, we developed a series of guiding principles that really outline the policies that we need to get from where we are today to where we want to be in 2040. And so looking at those guiding principles, they really fall into 6 categories: supporting policy and legislative efforts to get us to a circular economy, minimizing plastic waste through recycling, advancing the circular economy through manufacture of products, supporting a national recycling framework, supporting markets for recycled content, and promoting sustainability within the circular economy. To dive into some of these in a bit more detail, the policy and legislative efforts would include things such as advanced recycling fees or other types of fees that would help create more sustainable financing for some of the programs. In terms of recycling plastic, looking at ways where we can promote mechanical and advanced recycling, looking at design, product delivery methods in terms of advancing the circular economy, a national recycling framework. There are discussions ongoing with many of our partners about crafting legislation that would really push us toward more of a national framework for recycling to help address the 10,000 plus individual recycling markets that we have now. Developing end markets, and Nina touched on this a number of times. Collecting and recovering the material isn't enough if there isn't a market to pull that material into it. And a number of our member companies have made commitments along that. And then promoting sustainability. In addition to the guiding principles, we developed a roadmap, which really looked at, how can we pull together our value chain to identify the responsibilities and the actions that need to be taken by the various actors across the value chain and other stakeholders involved in the current system to get to that 2040 goal. So again, looking at involving the value chain, building support, catalyzing the engagement with industry and stakeholders, engaging consumers to increase awareness, reduce things like wish cycling, provide access both at home and away from home for recycling, looking at collecting and sorting capacity. So how do we partner with municipalities and with others to upgrade MRFs and really increase the collection sortation of some of those difficult to recycle items, a lot of films and flexible plastics that Nina mentioned. Demonstrating and refining at scale advanced recycling technologies. We're seeing a lot of investment in the United States and abroad in advanced and chemical recycling processes. So how do we continue to improve those capabilities? And then growing economic support to stabilize recycling, especially for non-bottle plastics. So from the period about summer of 2017 to summer of last year, we've seen 64 announced projects worth $5.3 billion in the United States, which have the potential to divert 4 million metric tons of material from a landfill every year. The majority of these projects are in the advanced recycling field, and we do expect several of those projects to be coming online in the next few months. As you know, it takes a while to build projects and get them up and running, but we've gotten to the point now where we are going to start to see some of those projects come online shortly, which is very exciting. A few examples of some of the commitments, and some of these are really important. I have Shell up here and LyondellBasell, two of our member companies that have committed to purchase plastic waste to use in their chemical plants as a feedstock. So they would purchase the material, which would then go to a chemical recycling facility, be turned into a raw material that could then be used to produce new plastics and chemicals in their production. So Shell, LyondellBasell, and a few of our other member companies have made those commitments, which helps to stimulate market demand for that material, creating that pull. Companies like Eastman and SABIC have developed technologies where, with advanced recycling, where they're producing circular polymers. In the case of Eastman, polycarbonate for Nalgene bottles. With SABIC, they're using taking mixed plastic waste and turning it into virgin quality resin for Magnum ice cream containers and Philadelphia cream cheese tubs. Other similar projects with Dow focused on recycled polyethylene pellets for virgin resin, and Amsty and Agilix and Ineos Styrolution working to take expanded polystyrene and other polystyrene waste and convert that into styrene monomer for use in the production of new polystyrene. Other investments, and these are some of those investments we've seen, but really the point of this slide is to show the value chain engagement. So it's not just our members, but it's really a combination of resin producers, chemical companies, technology providers, and others really connecting to make some of these advanced recycling projects a reality. And so with that, hopefully I've bought us a little bit of extra time for the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stu. And so, excuse me, just to recap a little for every attendee. So now's the time where we'd really love if you have any sort of comments, questions, follow-up items from any of the presenters to unmute, and we can engage in a dialogue. And while we're all getting our unmute button pushed, or raise your hand button pushed, I just wanted to kick it to the presenters first to say, do you all have any questions for each other, or comments or follow-ups or build upon things that you heard each other say that you wanted to kick the discussion off with?
Yeah, actually, I just realized I forgot one of the slides that I meant to include. So I was going to share my screen again real quick. So just for perspective, from 2000, where there was EPR, to 2020 globally. So there is movement happening, and I think I'm a bit of a broken wheel here in terms of looking at it, and this is probably being steeped in my, I'm kind of thinking back to my time at Duke, was structuring a problem so that you put your highest problem at the very top and then you manage the trade-offs. Looking at these solutions in a vacuum gives me great concern, and there are a host of challenges with really developing smart EPR. But what I heard from Stu, and I've heard from a lot of very large converters and brand companies, is that maybe we do need to embrace full EPR so we have those feedback loops in place. And when I checked in with one of the converters, looking at policy in North Carolina, they're like, well, this is just an optics issue, because that nothing's going to happen with the House and Senate in North Carolina being Republican. And I thought, well, isn't that the perfect time for industry to lead then? If we want to embrace the policy tools that really stimulate the efficiency needed, the feedback that's needed, and the support to unlock the innovation that's needed, wouldn't now be the time to act? So.
Nina, I'd love to build on that a little bit. And I think you're exactly right. And there have been a lot of discussions happening. We know 9 states have introduced different versions of EPR bills at the state level already this year. There are conversations happening about a federal EPR legislation that ACC is a part of, as are many others across the value chain. But I think your point on North Carolina is a great one. With Republican control of the House and Senate, it seems like a great opportunity to really explore what options there might be to implement an EPR system that works for North Carolina, works for the region. The other piece, though, that's really interesting is when you look at successful EPR programs, oftentimes one of those trade-offs is competition. And so the more successful EPR programs in Canada, for example, create monopolies. And so what's the current system? And Lisa probably knows the answer to this, maybe others on the line. How many MRF operators do we have? How many haulers do we have? Is there an opportunity to reduce the dislocations in terms of creating a producer responsibility organization to support an EPR program, and then having the haulers and the MRFs and kind of all feed into that? If you have a lot of different independent haulers, if you have different people that are involved in owning MRFs, it really creates a lot of business disruption. But if you've already had consolidation in the industry, it makes it a little bit easier to make that shift. So it'd be interesting to hear what others have to say.
And I'm glad we're talking about EPR as one of these aspects of policies. But just to take a step back, would one of you take on the challenge of just giving us an idea about what EPR means? What does that look like? What are some of the most common examples of EPR that you've seen, just so that we know everyone's on the same page about what we're really talking about when we're talking about EPR? That has also sort of evolved a little bit over time.
Do you want me to take that, Stan?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. EPR, like I showed on the map, really started mostly in Europe. The green dot system in Germany is kind of the long established one. And essentially a company that produces it, it's usually at the brand level, is responsible for the cost of the material getting into the recycling system. And I say that very intentionally. It doesn't mean that it gets into a new product or it becomes fully circular. And so that's where the new directive out of Europe is looking at, I would say that Europe actually was exporting proportionally more to China than the United States was, and they have waste to energy. So we need to look at the numbers with we need to be very discerning in that. But in principle, the producer pays. So there are different forms of EPR where you can have 50% paid by government, 50% paid by the stewards or the producers. You can have 100% EPR, and that's more of the model in British Columbia. The resistance around that is that you have essentially a monopoly, but you also have great efficiency as well. So I don't know of a perfect EPR at this point. Those that are developing in Europe that have eco-modulation, which means the total environmental impact of that product creates a variable fee structure. So you create the incentive to design based on that guiding principle that's established. And I think that's the critical piece that has not been fully developed yet to make EPR meet the full potential. Yeah, do you want to add something to that, Steve?
I do. The thing that I want to add, and Nina, I think, really explained it well, is that part of the policy decision is where on that sliding scale do you want to make these different decision points? Is it 100% takeover by a producer responsibility organization? Typically, the brands don't actually take it over. They would contract to a producer responsibility organization. But do you want to give 100% of the responsibility to the brands, which means they really are responsible for that cost, but they're also responsible for managing the program, and so it takes municipalities out of the program? Or are you trying to create a structure where you're effectively supplementing the income or providing additional funds to a municipality to run a system? And there are trade-offs with both. If you have an inefficient system and you simply have the private sector provide more money to support the cost of that inefficient system, it doesn't necessarily fix the problem. And then to Nina's point with the eco-modulation, another aspect of that is government's role in establishing targets. So the government can establish targets that the PRO has to meet, but how much flexibility does the PRO have to meet those targets? And so these are some of the different trade-offs that have to be discussed. And again, if you have a system that doesn't have a lot of MRF operators, it doesn't have a lot of haulers, and doesn't have a lot of individual municipal owned systems, it makes it easier to do that transition than if you have than trying to do it at the federal level. It's an incredibly difficult conversation right now at the federal level, and it's questionable whether or not you could even craft a one-size-fits-all EPR system.
Yeah, and fortunately before COVID, my carbon, unfortunately, I had a very heavy carbon footprint because I did kind of a tour around Europe looking at different facilities and meeting with folks in the value chain. And some of the examples that Stu showed are some advancements that are happening in mechanical and chemical recycling because there's EPR, because there's a funding mechanism to support that. Also looking at, like you showed, the challenges of MRF. I've been in a ton of MRFs, and yeah, I mean, this is why I was trying to encourage folks to keep materials separate with retail take back. But I also visited a MRF in Germany that does a great job of handling film and turning it into a product. But there are upper limits to how far you can go with that back into specific products. And that's this very inconvenient truth that we've got to reconcile, is that you have demand for products and then you have supply that can reach certain levels of quality. So how do we structure it in driving the policy that's moving us to use the best material for the best application in a system that's equipped to handle that? And that's why we need that kind of broader type of EPR, and I think it has to be anchored in a carbon policy with regulation around toxins. And then going back to, if we keep our focus on what's the most fundamental objective, if we're trying to reduce landfill, probably don't want to push towards paper bags. It's a 7-to-1 ratio. It's a huge impact. And talking to converters that are in both paper and plastic, the engineers, as they explore the true trade-offs, it's just straight science. Many will recognize like the true environmental impact of using paper is enormous, but it feels better because it's a natural material. So this is, I think, where we have to get into that brass tacks around what is our fundamental goal that we're trying to design for. And I don't know, as far as really, we still don't know the full impact. If we're looking at the true cost study, what's the impact on human health? What's the impact if it's in our rain? We don't really know the true cost, but we do know that putting organics in a landfill is leading to massive methane release. And we're probably calculating at less than a half than the reality. The models that are available through EPA there's a lot of renegade gas that we're not even capturing. So that's a really important piece to keep our eye on the prize there around carbon management.
I don't know why, but I think that renegade gas should be a band name. I think that's awesome. So, and just to ask one more kind of clarifying question about EPR, because I think this also helps us understand like the scope and where it can be applied and maybe where not. Are there products that we typically see EPR applied to? Are they typically consumer products? Is it typically a type of plastic? Is it?
That's a great question. Yeah, there's tons of EPR already out there. We have it on batteries and carpet, mattresses, the hard to handle materials you put in it. Stu mentioned an advanced recycling fee, and that's kind of the first kind of elementary step to is just you put a flat fee. With EPR, you're looking at it more systemically, and you've got sliding scale, ideally based on how the product is performing in the system. So yeah, there's a ton of examples already of EPR. It's just not comprehensive. And to do it in the vacuum of, if it's just on plastic, you have the potential for a lot of unintended consequences, just given the sheer volume of fiber in the stream. So.
And Nina, that's a point I really want to emphasize. In the past, we have opposed EPR programs, but we've changed our position on that. And really, one of the nuances of our position is that we don't want to see EPR systems that drive people away from plastics. We want to see them applied across packaging in an eco-modulated way or in an equal way. That gets into a more detailed discussion, but regardless, if you set up an EPR system that drives people away from plastics, then what are those unintended consequences that you're going to get in terms of either taking up more space in the landfill or increased greenhouse gas emissions? And so
we've got a lot more PFAS, like a lot more.
I have to be careful with that. My colleagues down the hall will get mad at me.
Right. So I don't know if you guys want to explain what PFAS is.
It is a bit beyond my chemical industry knowledge, but basically it's an additive that is applied to waterproof something like paper.
Yeah, so almost all packaging with paper has PFAS, and it's a forever chemical. So that's what we have to be careful of, wishing ourselves away from plastic into something else. It's really just, it's less and local. And that smacks directly in conflict with our economic model of more and global. So,
yeah, Nita and I kind of talked about that on a call the other day about, like for instance, there is, on campus, we have this discussion all the time about reduction of single-use plastics. And, we have a compost facility on our campus where we process all our materials, and we've started to have this discussion about, what is the highest and best use of the alternative, because students don't want to use single-use plastics. Compostables are great, but a lot of that, paper-lined compostable boxes, and they do have that PFAS lining in them. And if it's not PFAS and that's eliminated, it'll be some other type of, like lining that we don't know the health impacts for. So, we're trying to have this balance of having discussions around where feasibly can we use reusables? I mean, that is, it's just better in so many ways, and you're not trading, one evil for a different evil type of thing, or,
Yeah, and so bringing it back
interesting.
to a policy perspective, you've got in British Columbia, they have EPR and they have a bottle bill, and they're moving towards a reusable structure for bottles within the bottle bill. So does Oregon. It definitely can be done. And when you have that system-based approach, you can implement those types of programs. It's the highly fragmented we're providing a public service in recycling, but it's meant to happen in the free market in a highly fragmented way without long-term contracts to make the case for investment. So it all really stems down to an economic problem, an economic policy problem. And if we put our value on what's most important in terms of, then we can structure all decisions from that. So, did you want to open it up to?
Yeah, there are some folks using the chat, but I'm going to call on you and just let me know if that's not okay, and I'll read your question. But so I'm going to kind of group these a little bit, so they're not going to be in order. But Jan Farmer, do you want to ask Stu your question directly?
Sure. So earlier in your presentation, one of the things you mentioned is that the American Chemical Council is supporting straws and single-use plastic items to be given out on request, which that's a very specific thing, ocean-friendly establishments that we talk to people about. Can you be more specific on how the ACC is doing that? How is actually supporting that?
So we specifically came out with a policy a few years ago, or I guess it was more of a statement a few years ago about supporting straws on request. There was a lot of discussion around the straw in the turtle's nose, and clearly we saw that it makes sense to only take what you need, kind of the first part of the waste hierarchy to reduce, and the easiest way to reduce is to not use something in the first place. So that's kind of where the straws on request policy originated. As I said, we put a statement out on that. In terms of the utensils on request or other things like that, we've supported legislation at the state level that called for utensils or other things to be provided to customers only on request and not just left out or given with all take-up meals. Like I know we're doing a lot of takeout lately, or maybe not a lot. We're doing more takeout than we used to with COVID, because you can't eat in a restaurant. And so typically the places that we go ask, do you need utensils? And of course we don't, because we're bringing the food home to eat it, and we've got plenty of utensils here. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
And Kaylee Cross is going to be here at 2:00 today to kind of tell us just about that scenario, Stu, about how her pitch is called "People Don't Want This Stuff," and it's just that, like, we're eating the stuff at home. We really, thanks for that. We said we didn't want it, but here it is anyways. Tim Holder, can you unmute and give us your question about numbers, and then if you wanted to build anything onto your statement about PFAS?
This is Tim. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Good. Okay. There was a thing I heard. It was an investigative reporting for about 2 1-hour sessions on broadcast by PBS. And then that was about a year or so ago. And then from a different reporter on NPR, it's probably more like a 10-minute report, that the plastic industry is starting to use plastic in our bottles and that kind of stuff. And then they started getting pushback by environmental groups that thought this was a bad thing. And then they started this campaign to use the recycle thing with the triangular symbol for reuse, different numbers. And this all got back to, well, it was a community-based, like in the national level. But behind this, one of the members was actually a member of industry who did investigation, kind of developed a method of inventing this system and then putting it back in, and was really meant that there really wasn't a way to recycle things. So I'm thinking, I've heard all these things that I'm like hearing this morning, yesterday, and I'm trying to put those two things, together, what they mean. I don't know if any of you have heard these programs that I'm talking about, or anything along those lines. So that's my question, and I thank you. And this is a great program. I really like what you're doing.
So I think you're referring to the PBS Frontline documentary, and our former vice president of the plastics division was interviewed as a part of that. Referring to the chasing arrows symbol, that's the resin identification code that's often stamped on plastic products, and that's really aimed more at the recyclers than at consumers, to help the recyclers identify what material that plastic's made out of. The numbers 1 through 6 each correspond to a different polymer, and then 7 is for everything else. So it would be helpful kind of in the early days of recycling, when the reclaimers would get that material, they could more easily identify, is this a polyethylene, or is it polypropylene, or is it high density, low density? What is the material that bottle is made out of? It wasn't really intended for the broader public, although it has been incorporated in a number of recycling campaigns. I think what we see more often as even a more useful symbol is the how to recycle label, which many of you see on packages, and that applies to lots of materials. And it'll tell you, for example, if you like on your Amazon mailers, you should take it back to the store if it's clean and dry, or on packaging overwraps that Nina was talking about, or different bottles. If the cap's not recyclable but the bottle is, typically we do want caps on bottles for recycling. It's pretty easy to separate those once they get shredded.
Well, I guess my question is, so you referred to one of your members that was interviewed for that series, but have any of you seen the ones I'm talking about, those ones that were aired on PBS?
Yeah, I think the question is was that intentionally a misleading addition to make people feel like more products than are actually recyclable are recyclable? And there's a whole sordid history around that. My former boss, when she was on the National Recycling Coalition board, there was a movement to try to move it from chasing arrows to just a triangle. And then some faction within the NRC was like, no, it has to all go away. And so the debate kind of got lost. And so we're still here with chasing arrows that are somewhat misleading. It is difficult to change molds and whatnot. And there is benefit in having that number. It's not helpful in terms of educating the public on what to put in the bin, but it is really helpful for those in the recycling industry to have at least the major category of resin type. I think it's an issue that needs to be addressed. It happens within the ASTM. That tends to move pretty slowly, but I think the question is are we conveying the perception that it's recyclable versus it really being recyclable? And so Stu's saying, well, the how to recycle label is kind of the first movement to bring a cohesion around it. Nothing's perfect, so that's still to be worked out, and maintaining, the transparency that's needed. And I kind of alluded to this, but I skimmed over it really fast today, that we've been able to say, based on the Federal Trade Commission, it's recyclable if more than 60% of the population has access to recycle. And that's a loaded word in terms of access. And we've worked on those access studies over the years. But the bigger question is, does the material actually flow through the system? And is it compatible with a major commodity that reclaimers are taking? So there's layers to say, yes, it's truly recyclable. And that changes based on the market. So therein lies a challenge with blanketly saying, yes, recyclable, not recyclable. But I think what it's pushing us towards is the big nut to crack is recycled content. How do we, if someone makes a claim of recycled content, how do you know it really is? What's the standard methodology that's globally agreed upon?
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Let's see. We're going to shift a little bit to a question from Dee Smith about bag bans and fees. Dee, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, I was just curious what you all think makes these bans successful, especially getting them started. You know, we in the Outer Banks, that was tried for a little while and was not successful. And what makes these work? What makes them stick? What makes policy passed? Is it all political? What do you all think makes it happen?
That's a great question. When you first asked it in the chat, I was thinking of it more as in terms of like, you know, have we shown that these are successful? And so that was kind of my first way of thinking about it. And I just want to touch on that real quick, is that there are a lot of studies out there trying to get at the effectiveness of bans and fees. And some are definitely better than others. There's a lot out there that aren't that well done, that are done after the fact, and they look back at trying to estimate bag usage and trying to estimate how bags are reduced. And there's a few out there that actually start from the beginning, that have a control, that really well document how bag usage declines with these bag bans and fees. And those have been done, you know, in Chicago, Illinois, and in Montgomery County, Maryland, are really the two places that have been well studied to show that these are effective. And I think that is one important piece of it. Still getting to your question of kind of what makes them successful and what makes them stick is being able to track them in other places and show that they work. I think that that's incredibly important. I don't think there's enough studies out there, or that there could always be more studies out there kind of documenting that the data is there to show that these do reduce bag consumption. In terms of, you know, getting them passed and what makes them successful and what makes them stick, it takes a long time. And I think it takes a lot of groups to be on board and to support it in the local community. I think it takes conversations about how do you make this equitable for the low wealth communities in your town and in your city. It takes conversations with city council and county council. It takes conversations with the solid waste management group or the solid waste management division, and all of that can take years. And so I think it's really easy to try to get something pushed forward and after a couple months give up. What we tend to also see is that when something does get passed, or when something's on its way to getting passed, it can pretty quickly get watered down. And so that was some of the examples I was giving in my talk of how policies have gotten pushed through, but they kind of have these gaps and these loopholes in them that make them less effective. We know that there is a lobby against these plastic bans and fees getting passed, and that's what happened in North Carolina to get the Outer Banks bag ban repealed. And that's what we see happening with a lot of these ordinances, is that in the final hours, they'll kind of get watered down through revisions to be less effective. And so that is just an ongoing battle to prevent these from getting repealed, to prevent these from getting watered down, and to be the most effective that they can be.
What is the goal we're solving for here, though, with the ban? Because if it's to reduce landfill, if bags make up less than a quarter of the film in a regular household, a ban will take away the option to recycle the other material, or we're going to have a heck of a lot more paper bags without a fee.
I think the goal is always to reduce at the source. And so there's always going to be times when you don't need a bag. And what we have been advocating for in Durham is to do a fee, which would still protect consumer choice. It would still allow a customer who wants a bag to use as a liner for their garbage bin, or wants a bag because they don't want to haul their reusable bag. It still allows them to purchase that bag, but it's going to discourage people from taking a bag when they don't truly need one.
Did you look at how much bag bans there's been in Europe?
No, we have not looked at Europe.
So I want to encourage us. This is my Duke background, probably, like, but what are we trying to solve for? Like, we got to keep that fundamental objective front and center. And I've just seen it play out where the unintended consequences emerge here. So I want to keep the eye on the prize around how we're managing carbon, and it's really important to keep.
I don't particularly want to jump in on the bag ban discussion, but I do like the what are we trying to solve for question. And I think carbon is very interesting. It's something we've been looking at more. And sort of a question of how do we solve for carbon? Are we solving for carbon emissions? And are we looking to reduce carbon emissions to try to get to that 1.5 degree target? And is that what we're trying to solve for? And then how do these policies just generally fit into that, whether it's an EPR policy or packaging policy or any other kind of broader global policies? What are we doing? Are we looking at carbon emissions and how can we prevent those carbon emissions? You made some really interesting points yesterday about the e-commerce and just our electronic society and carbon emissions there. I think it bears worth taking into account if that's the goal, or if it's simply reduce a specific item at the source as a goal.
Or another goal that probably a lot of folks in this group consider is impact to marine life and marine habitats. And Lisa and Jan Farmer both had some comments or statements on the bag ban stuff. And I wonder if that's going to pull a little bit into maybe this other goal of, there is an impact, to waterways and habitats and wildlife. And, how does that all fit in? So that's not really what your statement said there, Lisa, but I'm segueing to you that way.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think maybe for this group, the overall goal for whether it's a bag ban or a fee is a reduction in it becoming litter and ultimately marine debris. And so that I think there's guidance being looked for in what's the best option that will be sustainable either statewide or at the local level. And so I have, oh my goodness, so many questions, but I do want to say that leading up to the symposium this year, I had multiple calls from folks throughout the state, as far as Asheville, from basically Buncombe County to Beaufort, calls being made wanting information about bag bans. And now the questions are evolving into bag bans versus fees, which is the better option. And so it was actually really great that we have this panel at the symposium this year to be able to help address those questions. So, and some of those groups include the Sierra Club, the Waterkeepers Alliance, as well as Oceana. And I believe Randy Sturgill is on the call today. So maybe he has some other questions related to this coalition being formed to address plastic pollution. But one of the questions I have about the bag ban, and I'm not necessarily keen to do a ban versus a fee. I think fee is brilliant. But when you have a bag ban, why is it that a WRAP campaign would go away automatically? Why is it that that infrastructure would automatically disappear if there was a ban?
Yeah, it's a good question. It doesn't have to.
Okay.
But I do think, I just want to put it in the context of, are we creating the incentive for people to bring reusables versus way more paper?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
if our concern is around low income communities that are already dealing with landfill and the renegade gas, we're cranking that up if we move to a material that's a 7-to-1 ratio over plastic. It's got to be about just less. So we've got to encourage the reuse model. And there is somewhat of an equity issue, but this is how do we drive reuse? And so a WRAP type program, which is just encouraging people to, I think ideally it's bring your reusable, use less, and then bring back all the other household stuff that people, it's not on people's radar, but it's your bathroom tissue overwrap, it's your bread bags, it's your case wrap, it's very, that's the thing, it's in every household and every single business. And we don't have a good way to put it in our curbside bin right now. So the best option is retail. So what's happened historically is when you have a ban, then retailers say, well, I'm not giving out a bag. Why would I receive this material? So it doesn't have to be that way. I think it's just, this is more of an education piece that is required, or how it's structured within the policy.
So it sounds like that, and I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but the fee structure seems to work a little bit better than the ban.
I would say, yeah.
Okay. That's good for the group to know, especially folks that are listening and that are part of that collaborative effort to move policy change. And I have another kind of sidebar question relative to Stu's goals from the ACC and recyclability of material, of products and things like that. Are we talking about, and you say that it has to do with the percentage of the population that have access to recycling, which I have a question specific to the company TerraCycle, because, and you probably know where I'm going with this. I really feel like that TerraCycle is complete BS. And I'm wondering what you feel about that, because if you look at TerraCycle as being that, I'm using my air quotes, recyclable, if you look at what their model is, it's like, well, even cigarette butts are recyclable. So if things like that are, quote, recyclable and everyone has access to it if they have a mailbox, is that truly recyclability, or is it in fact BS?
So, Lisa, it's a good question. And in terms of TerraCycle, there are a lot of different models, a lot of different options out there. And I think we really need to explore all of them to figure out which ones work and which ones just don't make sense. And we're not there yet on TerraCycle. We're not there yet on a lot of things. But I think looking at the ACC goal, one of the reasons why we established the 2040 goal is because it's a much clearer and easy to understand goal, in the sense that everything gets recycled, reused, or recovered. And so it's not about access, it's just about the material physically getting captured and put into one of those buckets. Now, whether or not the TerraCycle bucket counts or the TerraCycle process counts as one of those buckets, we've got some time to figure that out. But really the goal is, how do we get to a point where all the packaging that's put on the market in the United States, and interestingly, similar commitments have been adopted by our members and their counterparts in Canada, obviously in the EU, and also in Brazil, and I believe in Japan, but I'm not positive about that. So we have seen a lot of companies making this commitment, a lot of the resin producers making this commitment to get the material back either as recycled, recovered, or reused in terms of packaging by that 2040 date certain.
I think that the name of the game is accountability. It's like we need transparency and accountability. And if there's a program that reduces that transparency or accountability. I don't think it helps us move to the right goal. And it just to be the broken record here, what is our fundamental objective? If we're shipping lightweight material long distances so we can feel a little bit better about what we're diverting, but we're not really embracing the recovery of it in the most low impact way, I think we might be adding distraction or furthering the problem.
It's a good point. I do want to chime in though on the exports issue. I mean, obviously that situation has changed radically in the last few years. The combination of National Sword and the Basel Amendment changes. The only country the U.S. can export to right now is Canada because we have a special agreement with them. But otherwise, the United States is an island amongst the world, unless we want to export things to Haiti. I don't think we can export to Mexico. We don't have an Article 11 agreement with them, and they're part of the Basel Convention.
It's still moving. Yeah, there's a lot of material flowing right now to Mexico.
Yeah, I mean, if it meets the exception, I guess that's okay. But for the most part, unless it's a pure polymer or it's basically a bale of water bottles, or not water bottles, but PET bottles with caps, it's not gonna move. Or if it does, it's potentially a violation of international law. So there will be interesting consequences on that. But that really is driving the need for a lot of these policy changes where we've got to figure out, just like you said, how can we manage that material here at home?
Yeah, and there's a lot of minutes in 19 years to 2040. If we're dumping more than a dumpster load of plastic in the ocean every single minute, how many minutes are there in 19 years? So
it's a lot.
Well, that's a terrifying number.
We don't have a lot of time. That's exactly the problem. And I think that's why there's this very strong reaction of let's just stop it, break free from plastics, because we don't have that luxury of time anymore.
But to your point earlier, what's the consequence of doing that? And so how much more trash? I mean, there was a study done, and I need to go back and find it, that looking at GDP and waste generation and how that was decoupled in the 2008 kind of early 2000s because of plastic packaging. So we're actually generating less waste based as a ratio of GDP than we used to, because we've gotten so much more efficient with our packaging.
Yeah, it's 3.5 billion tons of waste per day. And that would exponentially grow if we moved away from particularly thin film plastic. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying the reality of, based on, we've participated in some capture rate studies and generation studies in the Portland metro area and other regions. So breaking out what's in the recycling bin, what's in the trash. It is a staggering amount of organics and paper. And if you imagine the flip of putting more packaging, that volume and weight would grow dramatically. So it's just, this is the inconvenient truth. This is where I often feel like I'm in no man's land. I'm not advocating for the plastics industry, and I'm not advocating, yes, I'm just trying to say we've got to keep it really clear. What is our fundamental scientific based goal that we're solving for?
Well, Nina, I'm happy to advocate for the plastics industry, since that's what sends my oldest to college right now. And I do think we are taking this problem very seriously, and we're looking at the challenge of multi-material, multi-layer packaging, especially. And that's where we see, advanced recycling as an opportunity and something that we can manage, because we can buy the offtake. And that, I think, is a key element here. And if you look at aluminum recycling, it doesn't work the way mechanical plastic recycling works, where it's kind of downstream of the producer. That material goes back to the producer, and then they make new aluminum out of it. We need to get to more of that kind of a system with plastic, where we as the producers are getting our material back in a form that we can use as raw material feedstocks. And that also helps us diversify our feedstock mix. It has a lot of opportunities. And then, of course, we can make a virgin quality pellet out of that. The question is, and I think you brought this up before, we need some kind of accountability system for that. And so is it a mass balance system? Is it something else where we can track, what material gets counted as recycled the way you would track, what portion of energy gets counted as renewable energy versus regular. Because once you mix those electrons together, just like once you mix the resin together, it's really hard to tell them apart.
Which is actually the same for aluminum too. Once you have an alloy, it's not quite the level of recycled content that people think in aluminum, but yeah, do we need to open it up to other people? I feel like I'm kind of.
No, this is really interesting, and we do have some other thoughts, but I mean we also still have 15 more minutes, so I would say this is good. Keep going. You're building on each other. Go for it.
Well, I kind of glossed over it a little bit. The IHS study, the exact point of that was how, and when I spoke in front of the World Petrochemical Conference a couple of years ago, I think it was like maybe 2,000 people in the audience. I was like, we have a loss of social license, the plastic recycling industry. We have to embrace how we track carbon. Once there's value on carbon, there's a heck of a lot less probability plastic's going to become waste. And so the only way to unlock this and really move towards petrochemical companies vertically integrating into this process is to have enough value on carbon. And so we need to get behind serious carbon policy. It's not simple, just like it's not simple to track and have methodology around tracking recycled content. It's not simple to have EPR, but again, we live in the most advanced time in history in terms of being able to go in outer space, to be able to think about something and have it arrive that day, basically from Amazon. We can apply that type of technology in the reverse, but we haven't even tried. And so, I took a team of engineers from one of the largest petrochemical companies on a field trip around California, looking at potential supplies to feed their technology. And they're like, don't you have some cleaner stuff? Even the mixed retail material, which is the segregated, wasn't quite clean enough. So I think it's how do we focus more on stratifying the collection of material so that it can go back into this new technology. And it's not really new. There's chemical recycling's been around forever. It's just new in terms of making it economically viable. Again, that's why I think that IHS study was so particularly important. Where is the pivot point where it makes economic sense for petrochemical companies to vertically integrate? They're too big to not be a part of the solution.
Well, the carbon conversation is very interesting because, as you said, if you start to attach a value to carbon, that's going to discourage things like incineration or other areas that would release the captured carbon within that package or product.
Yes and no, because if you look at the true impact of, again, I think waste energy is at the lowest end of our solutions, but going back to what is the risk of a landfill in low-lying areas and the renegade gas, what's the legacy impact of this buried material versus harnessing fuel and potentially the monomer to go back into the product? It's your best way to stem the tide of how much new extraction is being opened up. I mean, just the sheer volume of methane from every time we extract something is staggering. So we got to get right to that source of, let's use what's already out there. What do we have? 11 billion tons of plastic already in the environment. That's just been up from 8 billion the last study. So we've got plenty already in the environment that we need to do something about. And as Scott said yesterday, the longer we let it just sit, the less value that intrinsic value of that material is degrading very slowly in the environment happens.
I'm gonna ask Jan Farmer and Jan, you had a question going back to bags, but then you also have a question about working with brand owners. So I'm gonna let you jump on and one you want.
I've even got a third one that I haven't had time to type. Okay, so this one is probably more for Nancy, but is there any data that you are aware of from the bag ban at Outer Banks? Both, I'm pretty sure there's some data from before and during the bag ban, but I'm wondering if we've captured any information since it was repealed or essentially outlawed at that level. Like, can we see a difference in plastic bags in the environment before while the ban was in place, and then have they increased after? I mean, logic would tell you what the answers are there, but I'd love to know if there's actually supporting data on that.
That's a great question. We are always kind of looking out for studies like that that have been done. And you see that trend very clearly through California's. They have a coastal cleanup day, which I believe is an international cleanup day, but the one that is done for California, you see that very clear trend of plastic bags, the proportion of litter going down over time after their fees and bans have been put into place. In the Outer Banks, I have not seen that data, and I know that North Carolina also tracks that there is data out there from their coastal cleanup days by each year. Whether you see that trend or whether that's tracked specifically for the counties that had the ban in place, I'm not sure.
Okay, that may be data that just needs to be collected and collated. I agree. I think it probably exists. I just don't think anybody's that I've heard of put it together.
Right.
Thank you. The other question I had kind of is for all of you guys, but maybe more toward Nina and Stuart, are there any successful programs to encourage brands or manufacturers to really evaluate their packaging before they put it out? For example, I get lots of things that are multi-material packaging. So any one of them separately, I possibly could put into my recycling stream, but when they're all stuck together, that's just trash.
Yeah, there's a ton of work on this happening right now. And that's what I was kind of alluding to, is that we haven't provided designers within brand companies that true North Star to design for. So many are internally struggling with, do we design based on science, full life cycle impact? Or are we designing based on optics right now? We're leading a coalition, not coalition, but a group of brand companies in the US and in Europe that have a particular packaging format that they want to get deemed recyclable. And part of that was first to look at, here's the full market share of this package, what is most of it made out of and what goes into it. And then to look at, how do you harmonize design so all of the companies in that market share shift so that they've aligned on something that's compatible, so it truly is compatible with the entire system. So this is kind of the building of this roadmap to recyclability, but I just want to keep the eye on the prize. The ideal is to get to a circularity quotient, which is how much recycled content, what's the life cycle impact, and is it recyclable within the current system? So the question that some of the brands that we're working with is, what's the infrastructure that we can design for right now? And what's the infrastructure of the future? What is the infrastructure for composting? What are some of the emerging materials? Berkeley Lawrence Lab is looking at what are the future materials and how do we design a sorting system based on that new, the new materials that can be used. I think the large brands are, but I think smaller brands maybe are quicker to move, but don't have the resources to maybe look at that longer term research and forecast of what will be the demand for their products. But I'm seeing a lot of shift towards looking at how do we support a more regenerative agriculture. And so there will be more of a need to carry organics. My master's thesis at Duke was evaluating the trade-offs between a bio-based plastic versus other materials in the water bottle application. And it was an eye-opener for me in 2007. And it kind of has kept me steeped in keeping the focus on science.
Cool. Well, not to monopolize you, but while I'm not muted, is there a source out there similar to what you shared with us yesterday and today, where you've got the recycled materials website showing what consumer goods, like what percentage of recycled plastic is actually in those particular consumer goods? Is there something out there like that a consumer, myself for instance, could go to look at a consumer product and really see I don't know, maybe the circularity quotient that you were talking about, or what I'm thinking of is just the actual environmental cost of that product, So like you were talking about evaluating a plastic versus a compostable product, you know, they have different consequences environmentally, each of those, and something that would give someone something they could use to really evaluate that consumer product for their particular use.
This is the Holy Grail. No, and there literally is a project called the Holy Grail, but not yet. But that's what we're hoping to support and work on with others. WWF has some tools that are moving that direction. I think the U.S. Plastic Pack is working on that. We are developing an app basically that helps the general public within a typical household evaluate the trade-offs of different materials, but getting on pack. There's the Holy Grail technology is basically an invisible code that you can look at and get better information on what's in the product, what's in the package. Potentially it's connecting to the GS1 database. There's also something called the Smart Label. This is, I think, what's necessary is what is the actual circularity quotient? What's the environmental impact of the product and package? And once we have that transparency, then we're really driving and unlocking true innovation, but it does not exist yet in the US, Europe, or anywhere that I know of.
Thank you.
I think that Scott had a question along those lines, and I don't know if that just got to it, Scott, but about, you know, is there any ideas about how to educate the general public on the basic principles of life cycle impacts and analysis? And certainly a tool like that would be so beneficial for that, but anything else you can think of that's existing right now that helps people walk through those choices and those trade-offs?
Yeah, I mean, Ellen MacArthur Foundation has some information in terms of the companies that are reporting in. We have a cost benefit greenhouse gas calculator. The EPA has iWarm that helps you look at recycling different materials, what their impact is. But I think this is what's ultimately needed, and that should be what's driving policy. So.
Yeah, and I just took myself off mute. To kind of follow up on that, you know, those tools you mentioned, I use those on a pretty regular basis. But most people, when they're having to make that choice between a paper and a plastic bag, they don't have that information in front of them. And it's not a clear decision, right? So there's obviously the concern about the plastic getting into the environment, but there's also the greenhouse gas implications of taking a paper bag. And I'm curious if you could use even an example like a bag fee structure and allow the choice of you bringing your own or using paper or using plastic, but have the information printed on those different items about what your choice is, how you're making your choice and what it means from a life cycle standpoint, and how the impacts to different parts of our ecosystem are impacted differently for different materials.
Yes, I would like that. Yeah, and that was the last slide that I was sharing was, you know, is we have to look at through the lens of land use. We need to look at through toxicity, through water consumption, through greenhouse gas, energy consumption, performance. Cost is always, and that was the big piece within the modeling that I did for my master's project, but cost is variable based on what our carbon policy and regulation over toxins and the impact on the environment is. I mean, our structure has been codified this way, and it's when you can externalize all of the cost of downstream in terms of disposal, and you externalize the costs on extraction. Both sides of the equation have made it, we've codified the policy to make it a linear model. We can codify a circular model.
And Robin, do you want to jump on and ask your question about credits? That kind of segues nicely into some of those other ideas that Nina was just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is Robin. I am a part of Chi Blada Recycling. And I just last week came across the WWF position paper about plastic credits, and the paper that came out, I guess in 2020, about plastic credits and how they can be done responsibly. And so since we've got a whole bunch of policy experts here, I was just wondering if you guys had any ideas or any thoughts on plastic credit programs, because we're thinking about maybe trying to implement something like that for Kai Blada as a funding source. My biggest concerns with plastic credits, which I'm sure is some of your concerns, is that people think that it's just a get out of jail free card and they can just like pollute with a bunch of plastics and then like, you know, pay for it with some money. So it would need to be a holistic program where we're having people pledge to reducing their plastics and water consumption and carbon footprint and all of those kinds of things. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about plastic credits?
I do. I don't know. Is there anything particular that you want to share, Stu?
Yeah, I was, it's something that we've talked about a little bit to try to help better account for the cost difference between recycled resin and virgin resin. But I think that's a slightly different form of plastic credits than what the question is.
Yeah, I mean, the WWF report, I think, was really important because it's incredibly ripe for fraud, and it can be a get out of jail free card, or kind of a absolve your sins type of approach. On the other hand, just because it's difficult and complex doesn't mean that we shouldn't be embracing it, because I think it has the opportunity for creating a funding mechanism to those that are actually handling the material. The co-ops throughout Brazil that really do benefit from the PCR credit trading. That's been recently brought to my attention because I was feeling like this is really ripe for fraud. But I always look for that third option. What if we tighten up the system? What if it's really tied to a carbon policy? What if it's tied to natural capitalism? I think there's huge potential in it, but we also have to go into eyes wide open, like WWF illustrated.
I think another option that we've talked about as well, instead of a credit policy, is really looking at engaging with the informal sector and finding ways to increase the value of what's being collected, and whether it's directly with the informal, whether it's with those that are picking waste, whether it's with junk shops, whether it's with aggregators, kind of what are the points within that informal system where we can increase the value of that material and really encourage collection of material that's not currently being collected. And so it's a different way to get at a similar problem in terms of creating sustainable funding mechanisms. And I think that's maybe the broader question, is how do we create sustainable financing for these systems? In some cases it's EPR, in some cases it's an advanced fee, maybe it's credits in another case, and maybe it's working with the informal sector to create some kind of a value from collecting low value plastics.
Yeah, and I think just to bring it back to North Carolina, and it seems like the energy or interest is around bags and fees. If we want to drive behavior change, creating a fee where that funding is earmarked for the things that are needed. And just lost my second piece of that, but yeah, I think we need to look at it from the structure of, well, it's the landfill also, like how inexpensive is it to landfill? And if we tax the bads and not the goods, we're creating the behavior change of conservation. So I think we need to make sure that the fees that are applied are actually going towards solving the solution and providing the education to create that momentum.
And that's one of the big challenges from a policy standpoint is ring fencing or protecting those fees. Because if they go back to a general fund, there's very little you can do about it. And I think Europe is a great example. The non-recycled plastics fee that the Commission is charging the EU member states is basically just a way to help plug and actually it doesn't even fully plug the Brexit hole, but it's just a way to get extra revenue into the Commission to help offset a budget deficit they have. None of the funds will be used to address any kind of plastic recycling or recovery or anything like that. They just named it that because they knew it would be easy to push that through. So it's important when these fees are created to make sure that there's a way to dedicate that funding to a specific purpose and not just create it as a general revenue raiser.
Yeah, and I just will never miss an opportunity to talk about how that's happened in North Carolina and how there used to be a lot of funding mechanisms that would fund a solid waste trust fund that was eliminated under the McCrory administration. And so it was funded through different things, a tire tax, white goods tax, but also a $2 of every tip fee ton that goes into a landfill, $2 out of that tip fee would go into this fund. And this would fund local government programs for collection of recycling and education efforts and all these really good programming that helped us expand infrastructure and programs across North Carolina. And that fund doesn't exist. All that money goes into the general fund. They are appropriated some money back. It's just significantly less. So if we are putting on our, talk to our legislators hats, I will never miss an opportunity to tell a legislator that they should look at restoring that funding. It was really used well and effectively in North Carolina.
That's a good point on the EPR. It's just coming back to the EPR discussion we had at the beginning. When you establish a producer responsibility organization and you keep the funding outside of the government, but the government establishes targets, sets the eco-modulation fees, things like that, it reduces the chance for those kinds of things to happen because the government doesn't have the opportunity to divert those funds because they never make it to the general treasury.
Yeah, that feels safer sometimes. So we're just a few minutes over, but this discussion is amazing. And I kind of wanted to end a little bit where Nina was going about bringing it back to North Carolina. And if we, I don't know, this is probably a hard question, but if you take a look and, this is for everybody, I'd love your opinion on it. You take a look at policy in general, anything that we've sort of talked about, or even things that we haven't talked about today. What do you think are some of those options that might have the biggest impact in North Carolina, whether it would be just because it had a big impact or because it'd be easier to implement than some other types of things, like where do we have momentum, that type of thing. So even if it's like a federal thing, but it would impact North Carolina, or maybe it's like like Nancy's work is around local things, what can we do locally? So just wanted to put that super loaded question to you to see, if you could say, hey, I think that this is a avenue for policy development that would have a big impact or could get implemented pretty easily and effectively in North Carolina, what would you point us to?
Steve,
I would say,
go ahead.
I would just say that I think there is a lot of momentum around the local communities to do something about plastic waste. And so, as you all probably aren't surprised, I would advocate that starting at that local level and having the communities work together to put forward policies at the same time. I think that our legislature right now is not going to be favorable to passing something with plastics reduction, but if the local communities have the momentum and can band together and pass things at similar times, I think that puts us in a really good position to basically do something as a state without needing the state legislature.
What do you think, Stu?
So since my local knowledge of North Carolina is not nearly as robust as anyone else in the room, I'm going to suggest something more from a process standpoint, and that is create a process that is inclusive of all the stakeholders, bring industry, bring environmental groups, bring other stakeholders to the table and figure out a practical way forward. And the chance of getting policies move forward that use that process is very, very high. I mean, you can argue that the Save Our Seas Acts were not very ambitious, but they both passed with bipartisan support. And the second one was more ambitious than the first. We're talking about the third one now. And we as industry are really getting pushed on that. But there's been enough goodwill created through that process, through that inclusive process, that we're willing to get out of our comfort zone a little bit more. And so I think it's important when you're thinking about local policies, to the extent that you can bring the business community into the discussions early on, you're going to create enough goodwill that you won't get as ambitious a policy as perhaps you wanted, but the chance of getting something is much, much higher.
Well, I would say, given North Carolina has a higher than average percentage of reclaimers, plastic recyclers in this state. It's interesting, high areas are California, North Carolina, and the Southeast at large. So I think looking at, as we look, ideally shift our paradigm to put more value on a circular economy, on sustainable way of living, how do we tie economic development with the transition to sustainability? And so I think looking at forming more of a market development center, there are examples in New York and Washington. There's a lot of work happening in the Midwest, in California, and we have some of this on the info exchange. I think bringing together, as Stu said, more of the collaborative approach that's looking at from a systems-based approach is what's really necessary, and it can support our economic development. In the short term, there are some low-hanging fruit. I think we should be pushing minimum content on some large items like trash bags. Why not have recycled content in an item that's going to the landfill? It's a 6 billion pound market. It can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. Bottle bills are controversial, and it's difficult in a small state because of material flow across borders. But these are the kind of the low-hanging fruit tools that we should be deploying as we develop a more systems-based approach. I think that's it.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much. And I think that that's really good perspective as we all sort of walk away from the Marine Debris Symposium, and we're really pumped up about doing something. And so I think this helps put that a little bit into perspective and say, where should we devote our energies and have a lot of impact. So I think all those thoughts were a really great way to close the session out. So thank you so much to all of our panelists and speakers for the policy panel. And we are going to be back at 2 p.m. We're going to hear about some projects and some fast pitch ideas for marine debris reduction.
Thank you so much.
Do you have anything
Thanks,
else?
Heather.
No, thanks, Heather. Thanks, panel. We'll see you back at 2.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.